Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Support Stack. So, Thomas Hils, welcome to Support Stack. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Pretty stoked to be here and to chat through some of the stuff with you.
I am excited. So, you are head of support at Wingspan, is that correct?
That's right. For the past 2 years now.
Excellent. And so you and I spoke because I saw you in a customer community that we're part of called Support Driven, and you were talking about how you were using Claude, in particular Claude Cowork and Claude Code, to really dig into Intercom and get some pretty sophisticated workflows done that would just have been utterly impossible before now. So we're going to do 2 episodes together, which I'm really pleased about. And today is the first one. So tell me, what are you solving for today?
Yeah. I think everyone kind of knows the importance and the relative pain of doing QA for your team. And that's been something that's really been on my mind lately as we've been growing and scaling, wanting to make sure that that quality bar is really where we want it to be. But to do that in a way that felt both, honestly easy for me in my time as I'm pulled in a lot of places, but didn't require an expensive tool. Since Clause, we lost them, rest in peace to Zendesk, was,
Yes.
they were one of the best tools out there, in my opinion. I still have my socks from them with the little cats all over it. So I
I'm
was looking for.
confident that if I look around this room, even I think 10, 12 years after I met some of the people from Claus at a conference in Serbia, I'm just confident that I could find some cats somewhere around here.
They had great swag and just a great demeanor. So much respect to them. But what was great about that tool for me is it was at the right price point for smaller teams where you're at that size where you do have to do a substantial amount of QA to keep up with everyone, but you can't be dropping, 50, $60 per head on your QA tool. And so I had tried a few different ways to solve this problem, mostly as toys. I was using kind of like lovable style AI tools to build an app that would pull tickets from Intercom, which is our ticketing system, and help me QA those. And that turned out to be a nightmare. It's everything kind of what people joke about AI tooling to be, where you could get like a slick interface, but once you actually started getting into the specificities of it, it just choked constantly. And then Claude Cowork came out, and that kind of pushed me towards where I have landed now.
Great. So this might be a good point to pause and just explain what Claude Cowork is for people who are not deep into the Claude ecosystem. Do you have like an easy definition for Cowork? Because I couldn't tell you what the difference is. I just know that I use it a little bit.
Yeah, I think Anthropic does a lot of things right. I don't think they've really been able to clearly articulate the value of Claude Cowork. I know when it first came out, I was just confused. I was like, I don't understand why I would use this. But it seemed like they were pouring a lot of resources into it. So that drew me to it. And what I'd say is, at a high level, Claude Cowork is Claude code, but for people who aren't necessarily engineers. And what it can do that Claude, the chat interface, can't do is a few things. First, it exists in a local virtual machine. So it's running its own kind of virtual computer where, one, that's a safety measure, but two, it's allowed to do more things on your computer, which at first is kind of abstract, but you'll see a little bit of what it's done later on to get some context there. Second, it's multi-agent. So you might ask it a question and Claude can determine whether to spin up multiple agents to help solve that. So it can have kind of some bulky, intensive tasks. For example, I was just syncing a bunch of local documentation back to a hosted source. And instead of doing that one by one, as Claude would if I asked it in a chat, it spun up, 10 agents, and each of them took a chunk of these docs and then could do that work for you. So none of that was like a pithy description of Claude Cowork, but it is a little bit closer to the difference.
Okay, okay, that's great. So you discovered or you found out about Claude Cowork at the same time, I guess, as you were trying to think of uh, more efficient ways of doing quality assurance on your team's conversations that they're having with customers. And so maybe it's important to pause for a moment as well and say like why actually like you're a head of support, you know this, and any other head of support or director of support probably knows it, but I feel like there's a point that we're getting to now where teams who weren't traditionally doing QA, it's probably a good time to start doing QA when you're getting good use out of Fin, especially because I don't know how you're finding this, but certainly the people I'm working with, once you hit the sort of 60% resolution rate, it's mostly very difficult interactions that end up with your teammates. So
Absolutely.
is was that one of the triggers as well for looking at getting better reach for your QA?
Absolutely. We've hit that kind of 60% mark with the tickets that we do feed into Fin, and that does leave the most complicated or emotionally charged tickets for
Mm,
the team. And where there was a time that, I would say the mix was more like 60-70% easy tickets ending up in the individual agents buckets. Now it's like probably 70-80% of those tickets are quite tricky. And to us, that meant, especially as a team who's growing, or excuse me, a product that's growing and changing quite quickly, we had to be certain we were giving the best possible answers. We couldn't just expect these more tricky tickets to be a small minority of that work. So I wanted to make sure that that consistency was there. And at the same time, that we're also sharing knowledge as we learn different troubleshooting mechanisms or different changes to the platform that would impact how we deal with these very complex tickets.
of course, of course. So can you talk us through the first thing you did, the first way you approached this was it first using Claude Cowork or did you try an earlier version through Claude?
I went right to Cowork. Part
Mm,
of what inspired this was I wanted to understand Cowork. I knew there was something to this tool. There was a reason that people wanted it, or that they at least built it, and I wanted to kind of experiment with it. And this was a kind of problem that I had that I thought I could throw at this. And one of the first things that stood out to me, of course, is that Claude has a connection directly to Intercom through the Intercom MCP. And some of the biggest struggle
absolutely.
that I've been having with these kind of ticket QA tools I was building was that ability to cleanly pull in tickets and then format them and the conversation inside of that correctly. I don't know how many folks have worked with the Intercom API, but the way that conversations are returned are in these chunks, and it's a bit of a nightmare to necessarily structure it all the way that you want. So my
Yeah.
first thing was just like, hey, Claude, can you grab 5 tickets for me to QA? And of course, it returned 5 random tickets from anywhere in our intercom workspace. And that's when I realized, okay, yeah, this is a spark, but there's a lot of kind of defining and scoping that I needed to provide it to get kind of what I actually wanted out of it.
Yeah. Okay. So this wasn't you just being like, hey, Claude, go and QA 5 conversations. Give me a score, and then I'll just pass it straight to the person who interacted with the customer.
Yeah, I had hoped it could be that easy. The next step was feeding it, of course, our internal QA scorecard, which really highlights the difference, I think, between how like a human can read that type of content and then how a machine reads it. Because even then, just saying, "Hey, all right, here's our QA scorecard. Can you score these tickets?" Wasn't giving great results either.
Oh, of
It's very
course. I
interesting.
mean, yeah, of course. I talk about this all the time that the content you write for an AI agent is very different than what you write for a human teammate. We as people are a lot more forgiving of of the stranger structures and like um, in indirect references and all of the language that we all use every day. But an LLM is quite literal in a lot of ways, and I'm so used to saying that on the like fin and content side of it, the help article side of it, the content snippet side of it. But when you say it that way, of course, like you have to have a QA structure that makes sense to an LLM. So did you just was it a process of feeding that in and then you saw the mistakes that Claude was making?
Yeah, immediately it was pretty clear there were a few things that were lacking. First is nuance. Humans kind of fill in that context. One of the obvious examples, this is still actually a thing I haven't entirely squashed, is a best practice of ours is in a lengthy conversation of a complicated issue, you should leave internal notes so that if another person has to pick it up, this is what you can do. Uh, Claude's like, okay, where's the note? To just about every conversation. It doesn't have a great sense of what complexity is. It didn't understand like what the length really meant in this regard. Whereas a human QAing can kind of say, oh, okay, this isn't that hard of a ticket. Even if there is a significant amount of back and forth, Claude had that simple heuristic and it was applying it quite aggressively. Um, Second to that is just a lack of understanding of then the process. We started off feeding it product knowledge. I've been very lucky that our CTO, my boss, has set up a very thorough internal knowledge base for AI, written for our AIs across the company. And it references our code base and like human written definitions of each feature and their expectations of how to work, and even where in the code to look to kind of understand these different features better. And that is like a foundational change for us, and it's really improved everything we do when it comes to AI. But even that wasn't quite enough. You could say, hey, look at this ticket, give it the score based off of the rubric, but here's how you know if they are providing kind of accurate information. I thought that would be a slam dunk and really solve all of my problems, but even that didn't quite get me where I needed to be.
Okay, so why don't we go through and see what it would look like for an example?
Yeah, so I've got a ticket link here. The skill can either grab tickets for you, or in this case, we're using one version of the skill that takes a specific input link. That can be helpful if, like, I find a particular ticket that I want to QA versus having it grab random ones. And so yeah, we can run this raw score test. So it's going to go ahead and score this ticket without the calibration and context that we've done subsequently. Claude does run a little slow, so it might take a second here, but also it's quite thorough. Well, the second version of this is quite thorough, where it's going to read through, a pretty significant amount of product information, a pretty significant amount of calibration work, and then kind of give you a more organized and meaningful review. What has been tricky is, just kind of getting that content to be as bite-sized and understandable as we would like it to be, so that Claude doesn't have to constantly think over, 8 or 9 different docs. But that kind of long form context structuring is something that I'm learning a lot about to make these tools better, but isn't something
Yeah.
I knew very much about going in.
Yeah. I mean, it really makes me appreciate the work that Intercom has done to have Finn interact with customer conversations so effectively, especially when you have, hundreds of public articles and hundreds of maybe dozens or hundreds of snippets, and then you also have all the guidance and procedures and everything else that Finn could possibly interact with, and it just runs through it in seconds every time.
Yeah,
Okay, cool. So it's summarizing what the conversation is about.
yeah. So it starts off with a quick summary from my context.
Yep.
This would typically be a link so that I can open this ticket up myself now. And so how I have this run is it's a scheduled task. So every morning I wake up to just 5 of these all ready to go. So that kind of lengthiness in running isn't as
You
noticeable to
don't
me in
notice
my
it.
day to day. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you can see it scores by different elements of our rubric. So what we've told it is important to us gives a note for each of these individual attributes, and then it kind
Mm-hmm.
of puts together everything into an overall coaching note. Now, for our process, we do have one element that's pass fail, and that's our compliance checks. These just like regulatory requirements, where if those things
Of
aren't
course.
done, that's kind of a failure here. So you can see we score out of 5, where this idea of 3 is essentially kind of doing what you were expected to do. Four is like going a little bit above and beyond. And then five is just like these amazing tickets. And so, what I did find in this early version of the skill is that Claude can just be overly nice. It does try to
Okay,
score
interesting.
inflate quite a bit. So here we can see this worked out to a 3.5. And now if we scroll up and we do this again with the score ticket skill, where it's going to use that fully calibrated knowledge, we can see a bit of a difference here.
Got it. Okay, so
Okay.
this is the version that you worked towards. Is this what you're using today, or it's just closer to what you're using today?
This is a bit closer to what I'm using today. I've actually done quite a bit more work on top of this to
Yeah.
improve the overall process. One is that some of these like troubleshooting and process documentation, they originally lived in this kind of local folder of mine. Now they live in a support process database on Notion that's being
Okay.
ingested, and our CTO is doing some fancy work to frame them in a database that AI can access a little bit more quickly. So it doesn't have to read through all of these docs. Instead, it can kind of find the right one a bit more quickly. So
Great.
it's going to run, very much a similar process. You'll see that it is asking me some things that it typically doesn't, but it's going to see if there's a matching troubleshooting doc after it's
Hmm.
identified the issue. You'll see that it's reading them in parallel. This is kind of some of that element of multiple agents occurring at once.
Yeah.
And then
And
it
this,
runs.
like, it's doing more, but it feels faster. And maybe part of that is because it has the progress is showing like what it's doing, so it feels faster that way.
Yeah, it's interesting to dive into the thinking sometimes. In this case, we won't because it's not anonymized. But
Yeah.
it's cool to kind of see how Claude thinks about this. It'll reference things that it's like been told before. It'll reason it out, and sometimes I refer to that actually when we do calibration on the and the bot together, just to say, hey, I like this. You drew this conclusion from that. This is why that's not quite right.
Yeah.
You'll also see
Yeah.
it mentioning that it's checking the ESC. So one of the other parts of this process is if there is a linear issue linked to the conversation, which is how we handle our escalated tickets, it will pull that linear conversation and check the content of that as well. So that makes sure that, if we've created an ESC we shouldn't have, or if there's something we could learn from that linear issue that could apply to other things. Um, Now it's thinking out loud about what it knows that the raw score didn't. So
Right.
some things that it struggled with in the past, correctly identifying the AI bot that we use in Fin. So it wasn't always able to do that well. So we had to kind of work through that to get it to understand those differences, to understand what notes are and what we mean if a note comes from someone who's not being reviewed in the process. And then, of course, it's going to go ahead and reference these calibration docs. So you can see it kind of thinking through that logic and the difference between these scores. So
Yep.
ultimately, we're getting a 3.2 here, which is actually a pretty
So
significant
drop
divergence.
down from, I think it was 3.8 before. Yeah, there it is. So
Yeah.
interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And so it also talks through that logic here. In this example version, in the fully calibrated version, it doesn't have to compare the old and the new anymore, but it does
Of
give me
course.
that context. And from here, it asks generally if I want to submit. And that is where we would do further calibration. So I would have this ticket open in another window. I would review it myself to some degree, although I do less of that now as this is calibrated much more strongly to what we're expecting. And if
Yeah.
in this conversation we have a divergence, we have an exceptional ticket, Claude can use that, whether it creates a calibration in a kind of running log of what we've disagreed upon or what I've called out. Or it can take kind of like a really, really great ticket where there's like a five and use that as context for like what I really mean by exemplary, because that's a
Mm.
word that's very hard to define for AI.
Of course. Yeah, it doesn't have years and years and years and years of experience of delivering great customer support and seeing that whole range of customer support interactions that you would have, that support leaders would have. Okay, so I'm curious. Like you said, you don't as often now dive into the conversations yourselves and look and do that manual review to compare to how Claude has assessed the conversation, the calibrated version. What are the signs for you that you should give it another pass, that you should take your time and really dig into it as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the first indicators for me is I do read the summary of the ticket, and I'm looking
Yeah.
for processes that kind of I've built up an understanding of where I don't think it's as defined as well as it could be. So
Hmm.
I know that this is complicated. There's a lot of variations. And while I have gone through this kind of level of calibration and process creation to a pretty significant extent, there's just still edge cases in the product. And I've kind of got a mental model now of where I think Finn has a really good understanding, or Claude has a very good
Claude.
understanding of
Yeah.
things versus those that it does not. And I'll jump in there. Often I will look at something and just see the scores seem like pretty high and its reasoning doesn't necessarily land with me. And during those situations, I'll often ask it to just kind of explain the score that it gave. And what's interesting to me is that often, after you ask it to kind of deep dive on a score, it will go ahead and suggest an adjustment on its own. Um,
Yeah.
Part of me thinks that's like a limitation of the context it can have at any given point while it's running through these. And there's probably architecture things that I'd love to do to this to kind of make it more accurate in the future. But even then, when that happens, I ask it to suggest kind of changes to either our calibration or our process docs to prevent this type of like drift in the future.
Yeah, of course. And that looping back around is really important. Like these are not perfect machines, uh,
No.
especially because fundamentally they're driven by us and everything that we've ever done. And so, and as you pointed out earlier, they do err on the side of being nice in a lot of cases, and so, which is hard to hear, but we do have to make sure that they are giving honest assessments if we're gonna use them and rely on them. So you calibrate against this. Like by calibrate, what we mean here is you also check the work that Claude is doing and correct it against it. Do you involve other people in that as well, or is it just you and your grand vision and your strong fist of of QA?
Ah, that's a great question. And you mentioned like kind of biases. And what I've created here is a machine that to some degree QAs like I do, but that
Yeah,
means it's got
it's
all of my
the Thomas QA
shortcomings.
approach.
Yeah, exactly. And there's lots of things that I miss or maybe I didn't think through in doing these. So, what I've started doing is having members of my team run manual QAs and then submit those to me. And then I have Claude run through this process, except Claude will score it first. Then I will provide my human scores and this person's scores.
Okay.
And that gives kind of a more diverse set of opinions and helps me both catch kind of like logical shortcomings in my thinking, but then also identify just like the drift in understanding of like what is defined in a QA rubric. It reminds me of like the kind of like thought exercise people have done where like they ask you to give instructions to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and you have the person
Yes.
will follow very literally. It's that, but it's the same both for humans and for QA, for AI. Both of them will follow the instructions to the best of their knowledge, and they both kind of. It's interesting how they fail differently. One
Hmm.
thing that's come up in these like 3-person or 2-person, one robot calibration sessions is like the human desire to say that something is like better than average. So giving it that 4, but not being able to tie it to something explicit. Whereas
Yeah.
when Claude gives a 4 now, there is something it is explicitly calling out, and it will do that every single time. Whereas I think when a human reads a ticket, often we're basing this kind of on a feeling, even when we're trying to be very neutral and fair. And that was like so interesting to see as a call out in these calibrations is Claude being quite blunt, like, hey, I think you're just giving it a 4 without having a real reason. And
Yeah.
that was good feedback for us.
Yeah, yeah, that's very tricky to hear from 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 something that you have trained yourself.
Yeah. It honestly, it's been interesting to kind of think through QA through this lens, programmatically. What does it mean when you're teaching a computer this type of work versus what it meant when someone taught me to do QA and I taught my team to do
Mm,
QA? It is almost a very different process.
yeah. So okay, so I'm interested. This is a bit of an aside, but do you apply this to your version of Fin at all, or is this only for your team at the moment?
Yeah, I've gone a little above and beyond maybe with how I'm applying this. So I actually have a scheduled process now that's based off of this because why reinvent the wheel? Except when
Yeah.
it looks for tickets, it's only looking for Fin conversations. So AI
Okay.
handled conversations in particular that don't pass off to a human is kind of my first scope because humans will flag if there's something not quite right about Fin,
Yeah.
or Fin's responses. So it'll take a look at those and apply the same kind of criteria as of ticket QA. It'll look at the process documentation, all of our materials, and assess whether or not that it thinks Fin has done a good job. And the second part of that process is another skill I've built, where I've collected all this knowledge about how to use Fin. Granted, things change so quickly with them, it's quite difficult to keep
Yes.
up.
Yeah.
But it understands the concept of guidance and snippets and your customer facing docs and what those things are best for. And
Mm,
so when it identifies a Fin answer that's not quite great, it creates content that it suggests to use. To make that useful actually was a little bit more tricky. I exported all of our knowledge content, which you can just kind of ask Claude to write a script to download all of that. But there's not a
yep.
programmatic way to get your guidance or your snippets. And if you're like
Yeah.
me, you might have a lot of snippets that are poorly organized. So I let Claude run.
There is no way of like organizing content snippets apart from poorly. It's just poorly.
Yeah, so that was another problem I've had in the back of my head. So I had Claude run overnight essentially because it did take quite some time. Where Claude can use Chrome and it can very
Yeah.
slowly
Was
navigate a
this the
web
Claude
page.
Chrome extension?
Yes, yes. And so I hadn't used that before, so I thought this would be a neat opportunity when I realized I couldn't programmatically get this
Yeah.
information. So I kind of walked it through the structure of the guidance and snippet pages in Fin and had it
Yeah.
download all of those and create local copies. So it knows what guidance already exists. It's got kind of like a little map it's made itself of like what things might be impacting it. And when
Yeah.
it pulls a ticket, it actually gets all of the Fin kind of reasoning, what resources were used to make a decision as well. And at the end of this, like if it finds a content gap or a guidance gap, it suggests an addition or an amendment to get better answers out of it. That's only something I've started doing in the last few weeks, but I've already seen
Yeah.
some fairly good results from it.
That's a brilliant example. I've played a small bit with the Claude Chrome extension, and it is very slow. I agree, and I'm not surprised it ran overnight and did it overnight. But that is a very very clever way of. Now I'm thinking like, okay, how can I apply this for to get it working? Okay, that was a bit of an aside, but I think it's worth it because yeah, we were talking about QA for teammates, but as we referenced earlier, if you have a high resolution rate, if you have a high involvement rate, Finn is one of your most significant. Finn is probably your most significant team member from a conversation
Yeah.
volume perspective, and applying the same approach, the same QA approach, or a modified QA approach is probably a really important part for that as well.
Absolutely. And I wish there were a way that we could give Intercom all of the same context that I'm able to do through
Yeah,
Claude, but it just isn't practical with the current tooling.
yeah,
So it's nice to know that we can have a way to run through these things with just that expanded knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so uh what's next for this set in Claude Cowork? And if someone wanted to like create this themselves, how would you recommend they get started?
Yeah, yeah. It is a tricky thing. I've learned a lot of the wrong ways to do this, so I can definitely walk a little bit through where I started. First, I know a few things now. One, I would set that goal and intention out very clearly to Claude that you were looking to build a system to QA tickets, and give it a lot of context. So prior to even this step, I think there are much more fundamental steps, which is to make sure that you have context and knowledge in a way that could feed into this decision making process. I could have made a version of this without the knowledge base that our CTO created, and it certainly would work. But having that was super critical. And then from there, what I did was kind of pass over all of our existing human designed documentation about support processes, which I'll also note was just like lacking. So don't let your lack of content here be a blocker to this. This is also a method of generating that content too. But you want to set your Claude up for success. Um, Before even running a single command, the next thing I would suggest is really, really looking at your QA rubric and thinking through that gap of context between what Claude in an AI will understand versus what a human will understand from these statements is, I think, very, very important. And once you feel good about the kind of that structure, that's when I would kind of just dive in and start building with Claude. I think one kind of misconception I come across with my team a lot is they feel like they don't know how to build something in Claude. And what I think is most important is that you don't need to know. It's helpful to have like the knowledge I have now and go back and do it again. But this was a process of kind of talking it out and occasionally asking for help. So uh, the other piece I would recommend is start local. You want to keep this process as simple as possible. And whether your documentation exists somewhere like Notion, which a lot of teams will use, or it's in your Google Drive, I strongly recommend bringing that content local and putting that into a folder and working out of that folder with Claude Cowork. It allows you to choose a specific place to look, and you can start in there in this kind of contained environment where you have structured all of the content in a way that it understands. And doing that is a matter of saying, hey, these are my goals and my expectations. Here's that content. How can you put this together to kind of best deliver upon that? Because Claude's really good at knowing what Claude needs. And I think that's really critical to like ask as you go along.
Yeah, and you just do that in Cowork. So I by chance I just did this yesterday in Cowork where I set up a new recurring skill or scheduled skill. That's what it's called. And what I did was I went into Cowork and I said, please do this. I am going to create this as a scheduled skill. So ask me questions that help you build that scheduled skill and make the most out of it. And then, the other part of it that I said was actually the calibration idea that you said as well, which is, and include in that scheduled skill a question or a set of questions to ask me every day to improve the overall process and make it more effective every day. And it doesn't have to be a huge lot more complicated than that. Mine, I did jump straight to this to asking to run a process, but I think this is a lot more detailed than the thing that I was trying to do. And so this approach is, I think, a lot more effective to talk about it with Claude first before you get into the, hey, now go and get the conversations.
Absolutely. And you can start small. This was a process of many, many weeks for me to build up
Yeah.
a kind of structure and format that fit the needs that we have and like my comfort level with an amount of AI involvement. you might want more human interaction. And this could be totally redesigned where it walks you through every single score, asks you more questions about that so that you get the exact sort of process that you want. And that's just a matter of kind of figuring out what works for you and then asking for that to be built out. What I do strongly suggest is that cycle of self improvement. So when it QAs a ticket and it can't find a matching process, that gets flagged up front and interrupts the whole cycle of QA for me so that we can make
Mm.
sure we have a clear understanding of that process versus, just diving right in.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to share about this, the skill or Claude Cowork or anything else like that, Thomas, before we wrap up?
Yeah, I forgot like one key piece. Just for me, I think reporting is so critical, and what this lacks quite clearly is a clear reporting structure. So, what
Good
actually
point.
happens with these scores at the end is there's a JSON file, which it doesn't matter how familiar you are with the JSON file. I didn't choose that;
Yep.
Claude did, and I asked Claude then to build me a dashboard so that it can just report on this stuff for me. It generates a PDF that I can send to my agents so that they get these like
Super.
actually nice looking versions of this. And at the same time, I can go and look at these different attributes over time. I can slice and dice against the category that was set in Intercom or the subcategories even, and get a sense of like where we struggle as a team by category, by QA score point and all of that fun stuff, and just kind of have a very historical process. Happy to show that if that would be helpful.
All right. So you're showing this. This is the QA dashboard.
Yeah, you can see some early thinking here where part of me was like, maybe I'll want to submit reviews in this tool. Um,
Yeah.
I don't, it turns out. You could see the definition of the rubric here as well. And I added
Yeah.
this section more to see it as it evolved because
Yeah.
during the conversation, I have asked it explicitly to adjust things or add things to it. And being able to keep track of everything across Claude conversations can be tricky, especially because these are kind of intensive processes where you run out of
Hmm.
context pretty quickly. So splitting up into new conversations is great. And then you can just see kind of a full database, how we're tracking categories and subcategories, and then even the kind of individual reports that I generate from here. I click this little shareable button and it goes out into the world and does things. The PDF is took probably the most time of the whole dashboarding was to get it to produce a not ugly PDF, but some of that's just how I am with snobbery.
That's fascinating. I do appreciate this is like well beyond. If again, if you're watching this and you have not got anywhere close to started with this is. Let's just consider this months down the road. Building like this, so this is locally hosted, right? It's on your
Yeah,
machine. It's not. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's
So at least you haven't just deployed it online or something like that.
super.
But
It was surprisingly easy to create this, but yes, don't be intimidated. This was stuff that
yeah,
I've spent hours working on for the past
yeah,
month and a half, 2 months now, and you iterate
yeah.
slowly upon it and build out what you need.
I will call this out actually as a bit of a risk of Claude Cowork, and of Claude Code, is you can very easily just keep going with stuff. So before you start, know like what is the actual end goal that you want to get to, and then sort of gently resist. Claude doesn't seem to do it as much as I've seen ChatGPT do it, but resist the like, hey, do you want me to do this now? Like, just decide where you want to get to there, and then give yourself a nice long break. And yeah, you don't need to keep tinkering all the way.
I think that is such an important point. There's always like another thing you can do. And once you kind of get the ball rolling, it is exciting and fun to see what you can do just from your words. The fact you can produce all of this tooling without writing any code is just like a superpower. And sometimes I'm a little drunk
Yeah.
on that superpower.
Yes, me too. Yes. In a lot of ways, it feels like something that I mean, it's definitely something that I've always wanted to do. And I think in the sports side, we've had to beg for technical resources and engineering resources for decades. Well, decades in my case, but Yeah, now it's just totally magic. Thomas, this was fantastic. You've got another episode where you're going to come back and show us something else later. So anyone who is watching now and enjoyed this, I think will enjoy the next episode. But we won't talk too much about that now. So click that lovely subscribe button for now. But Thomas, where can we find you on the internet if people are interested in what you're doing?
Yeah, the best place to find me is my personal website, thomas.town. It's got all of my contact information there if you need me. Yeah, I tried to buy Thomas everything for a while.
So it's THOMAS.TOWN.
That's right. Yeah.
That's a really good one. Well, visit Thomastown anytime you want. You can find me and my daily email list all about Intercom and Finn at customersuccess.cx/daily. As I said, click that subscribe button if you enjoyed this episode. Click the like button, share it somewhere on the internet to feed my ravenous ego. And we will be back in the next episode of Support Stack. Thank you and goodbye.